Hey everyone, my name is Will Rutt. I'm the lead pastor here at Sandhurst. At Sandhurst, we want to love and obey God by the power of His Spirit for the praise of His glory, and we want to help others do the same. So as you listen to this message, I hope that you will listen with a readiness to respond. That we wouldn't just listen as hearers, but we would listen as doers. That we wouldn't just read and go, that we would read and go, Lord, let's go, help me. Also, if you call Sandhurst home, I want to re-exhort you not to just be a consumer, but to be a contributor as part of a radically unified need-meeting community. So let's engage the mission of God by the power of His Spirit for the praise of His glory. Let's do it.
All right, man, I love doing baptisms here. I love hearing the stories, and I hope that your heart is refreshed in hearing how God has been at work in kids and students and adults among us. That's just really good. One of the things that we want to do well as a church is communicate what's happening. And that's why one of the reasons we have this bulletin, just so you know, the bulletin always has whatever's happening and coming up. And one of the things on the bulletin is the hanging of the green. That's when we get this place ready and decorated for the Christmas season. And we want to have enough people helping, but not too many people helping to where it's not like efficient. So we're asking people, if you're able to help with that, if you put the slide up, if you're able to help with that, we're going to do signups, and signups are going to be happening in the back, all right? And we're going to be setting up after the service on November 24th. Lunch will be provided. Italian, I think is what we're having, aka pizza and salad. And so lunch will be provided. There's going to be a sign-up sheet, and if you're available to help, that would be really great, all right? Also, today is Veterans Day, and if you are a veteran in here, would you go ahead and stand? We appreciate you guys more than words can say. And we understand that our veterans have voluntarily put their life on the line to protect our freedom. And that is just kind of, it's a meaningful sliver of what we celebrate here every week, that Jesus voluntarily gave up His life to purchase our freedom. And we appreciate and we're so thankful for our veterans. So thank you. We are in a study through the book of John right now. And man, it is good. And I appreciate that John was not fuzzy about what he hoped would happen at the reading of his gospel. It comes towards the end of the book, and he says, "These things have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing in Him, you might find life." Which is what Adam talked about in communion. It's what we're celebrating in baptism. And it's just good. John wants us to see Jesus so that we will believe in Jesus, so that we will find a life in Him. And a fair amount of what we're reading today connects to what we talked about last week in John 2. So John 2, this is kind of part 2 of John 2, what we're reading today. So here's a little bit of a recap of what happened of what happened last week. All right, Jesus goes to a wedding, and with His disciples, His mom is there, and then Christ is at the wedding. The wine is out, and Mary comes to Jesus. Jesus, they're out of wine. And we saw this last week, that Jesus hears her saying something deeper than what maybe she knew she was saying, that she was saying, Jesus, there's shame, and there's no joy. Jesus, do something, remove the shame, restore the joy. And He's like, well, you want me to remove the shame, restore the joy? That's gonna take an hour that's not yet here, but is coming. Where Jesus at His hour gave His life, died and rose again to provide a purification that we cannot attain on our own. And so that purification has power to remove shame, to restore joy. And this is what we shared in these last week. And I so appreciate some of the stories that I've heard of people from our church being able to say, all right, I understand what God has done on my behalf to declare me righteous through faith in Jesus. And I also understand what it's like to have the work of Jesus covered up in my own shame. And I've heard a number of stories this week, and we're going to read about one a little bit later, of being able to take the shame to Jesus, to name the shame, take it to Jesus, and have Jesus point us back to his hour, the hour where he provided a purification to declare us righteous. So John chapter 2, part 1 is he brings the wine, he removes the shame, he restores the joy. And that brings us then to John chapter 2, part 2, where we get kind of a different picture of Jesus, where this story is commonly known as Jesus cleansing the temple, or Jesus clearing the temple. It's one of the few stories one of a handful of stories in the book of John where all four gospels actually tell this story. The only difference is John has this happening at the beginning of his book, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this clearing of the temple happening during the last week of Jesus' life, during Passion Week. So that could mean one of a couple things. It could mean that Jesus did it twice. He did it early in his ministry, and he did it in the last week of his ministry. Some people think that. More people tend to think that it's all the same event, one event happening at the end of Jesus' ministry, and John puts it here for a reason. Because the gospel writers are not trying to give a timeline of Jesus' life. They're giving a collage of Jesus' life to tell a story to help us see Jesus rightly, so that we'd believe in him and find life in him. So probably what we just read, happens later in Jesus' life, in his ministry, but John puts it here. Why? Well, we're going to see. And let me invite us to pray again as we turn and submit ourselves to God's word. Father, I believe if any good thing happens, it's going to be because you did it. I appreciate Noah sharing his story, and you just did a work that he wasn't expecting. You just did it, and you did it in this room. And I want to ask God for a hunger to see you continue to work like that. I want to ask for faith to expect you to work like that, and for faith that doesn't make demands, makes big asks but no demands. And so we praise you, Father, for however you work this morning. In your name I pray. Amen. All right. So pick up with me. John chapter 2, verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. And he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who were selling the doves, he said, "Take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." All right, Paul, scene and where is this place where Jews would come for a number of things, for prayer, for sacrifices. The first temple built by Solomon, all right, that was destroyed, but then it was rebuilt later. And then in about 36 BC, Herod the Great takes this temple, the second temple, and he gives some massive, awesome renovations. So we have this big temple, and that's where Jesus shows up, this place of prayer, this place of sacrifice. And he shows up, and this is a different scene than John chapter 2, part 1, right? In John 2, part 1, he shows up to a wedding, and he brings the party, doesn't he? But in John chapter 2, part 2, what we just read, he doesn't exactly bring the party. does he? I mean, he brings a different kind of party. He observes what's happening. And what does he observe? He observes selling animals. What else does he observe? Money changers. All right, now at this point, that would be not out of the ordinary for them. So Jesus would have been in the in the courtyard of the Gentiles. Okay, there's 4 courtyard areas. And this is where animals would have been sold for the sacrifice. And the idea was actually an idea to be helpful, so that as you're coming for this feast of Passover, that you wouldn't have to lug your animal with you the whole way. You can show up and you can purchase one in the temple that you can then use to sacrifice. So he observes this, but then what does he start doing? He's like, ooh, not sure I like this. I'll be right back. And he makes a whip of cords, of reeds, and he comes back in. It doesn't say he left, but okay, I'm just kind of imagining we know what he saw, and he comes in, and he starts whoopsh, whoopsh, whoopsh. He starts whipping the oxen and the sheep, and he gets them out, and the money changers, and the people selling doves. And what does he say? Okay, we don't have to guess. What does he say? It's in I'm in the wrong page. Nope. Yeah, John 2, verse 16. Take these things away. Why? Was it wrong for them to be doing what they were doing, selling? Not exactly, but we see what was wrong. Stop making my Father's house what? A place of business. See, when we look at the other passages that we'll dip into in a second, it's not so much that they were selling these animals there, it's what the place had become. A place of business. And what it had become in contrast to what it was supposed to be. You're making this a place of business. So, when his disciples see it happening, what do they say? Verse 17, his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. When we think of John 2 in this story, usually this is the story that we are kind of going to understand a righteous anger. Okay, yeah. A righteous anger. See, Jesus was angry, but he was righteous in his anger, and so he he started whipping people around. That's righteous anger. And I am not going to say that Jesus wasn't angry. I think you can make a good case that he was angry and that it was righteous anger. But when his disciples see what's happening, his disciples actually remember this verse, zeal for my Father's house will consume me, which is from Psalm 69. So when they see what's happening, they think, Psalm 69, zeal for my Father's house will consume me. And I want to read some of Psalm 69, a fair amount of it. And I want you to think, does this sound like Psalm 69 is articulating a heart of anger? Or maybe is Psalm 69 describing a different kind of heart? Just listen, Psalm 69, I'm going to read the first 13 verses, I think. First 12 verses. Psalm 69. Listen to this. Save me, O God, for the waters have threatened my life. I have sunk in deep mire, and there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and a flood overflows me. I am weary with my crying. My throat is parched. My eyes fail while I await for my God. Those who hate me without cause are more than the hairs of my head. Pause. I just want to remind you, when they see those who wait for you not be ashamed through me, O Lord God of hosts. May those who seek you not be dishonored through me, O God of Israel, because for your sake I have borne reproach. Dishonor has covered my face. I have become estranged from my brothers and an alien to my mother's sons. For zeal for your house has consumed me, and the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. When I wept in my soul with fasting, it became my reproach. When I made sackcloth my clothing, I became a byword to them. Those who sit in the gate talk about me, and I am the song of drunkards. So the disciples, they see what Jesus is doing. And I'm not saying there wasn't righteous anger, but when they see it, they think Psalm 69, zeal for my Father's house will consume me. A psalm written not from a place of anger, but a psalm written from a place of, what word would you put? Despair. Any other words come to mind? Suffering. Grief. Yeah, these are all great words. Anguish. Psalm 69, written from a man who is just in anguish. And the disciples, knowing Psalm 69, because they connected to Psalm 69, see Jesus. Not just anger, but anguish. And zeal for my Father's house will consume me. I see anguish. And so the question then is, well, what was the cause of such anguish in Jesus that he would come and do what he did and drive them out with a whip? What was the source of this anguish? And I want us to see Jesus here. I want us to see the anguish of Jesus. It was anguish because the temple that was supposed to be a place of prayer and sacrifice had been totally perverted into a place of profit, a place of greed. I think the gap is really seen when you read in 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings 18 is, not 1 Kings 18, 1 Kings 8 talks about, it records Solomon's prayer at the first dedication of the temple. And it's in 1 Kings 8. And I want to read part of what Solomon prays, because it just helps us see what Solomon had in mind, and I think as an overflow of God's heart for the temple, now in contrast to what Jesus is seeing, is in 1 Kings 8. And before I read it, I think it's helpful to see what Jesus says as recorded in the other Gospels. All right, Jesus says, stop making my house a place of business and get these things out. That's what he says in John. But what he says in Matthew and in Matthew and Luke is, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. And then in Mark, he actually adds a little bit, quoting Isaiah 56. He says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. And 1 Kings 8 says this. Again, this is Solomon's prayer. Also, this is him praying, concerning the foreigner who is not of your people Israel, when he comes from a far country for your name's sake. So when some foreigner, when some Gentile comes to the temple, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and of your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays toward this house, here in heaven, your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name, to fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have built is called by your name. Solomon's prayer is like, hey, I mean, it's long and it's good, but he's like, part of it is when the foreigner comes, when the Gentile shows up, that they would have a place here, a place to call on God and know this temple reflects his nature, called by his name, reflects who he is. And then Jesus shows up to this place that was supposed to be a place of prayer for the nations, and there's anguish. Because that was supposed to be a place of prayer is now a place of profit. and that which was supposed to be a place of prayer for the nations, like a place where outreach would happen, is now a place of, what would you say? A place of barriers. Because these money changers, what's happening is these money changers in the temple, they're upcharging everything, price gouging everything, and making it so hard for the temple to be what it's supposed to be, a place of prayer for the nations. And so there's anguish in Jesus' heart. And here's just what's true and what has been stirred in my heart from this. The anguish fills God's heart when the gathering of his people gets hijacked and leveraged for their own selfishness. I just want to say that again. Anguish fills God's heart when the gathering of his people gets hijacked and leveraged for their own selfishness. It's kind of hard not to read this and go, if Jesus came here to this gathering of his people, what would bring anguish to his heart? What would he want to start whipping around? And that was, honestly, a question that, it went from a question to I was like, oh no, I actually need to really think about this. And so I was doing just laps around the church, just thinking and trying to go, Lord, if you showed up here, would you have anguish that we have hijacked, in some ways where we may have hijacked what you intend to be a place of prayer, place of outreach for the nations, hijacked it and steered it towards our own selfishness and greed. And honestly, what I had a sense is like this sense in God's Spirit going, well, if I pointed it out to you, would you have guts enough to change it? Are you just happy to drink the Kool-Aid of the way things are and just carry on? I so badly, and our leadership so badly, wants to understand what does God intend for the gathering of his people in prayer and outreach. And I want to be so aware of if we as a leadership in what we do in our gathering hijack it and make it about something totally different, where Jesus would come and say, you've missed it. You've made it a place of fill in the blank. So I think to understand, to be able to answer that question, we have to have a starting point of what is the gathering. We know what the gathering at the temple was supposed to be, a place of prayer and prayer for the nations, a place of outreach, a place of worship and sacrifice. We know what it was supposed to be and why that caused Jesus anguish, because it wasn't that. What is this gathering supposed to be? Don't answer out loud, just think. What's sort of the starting place of what this is supposed to be? Well, that's a good question to ask. And I'm not sure that we can really, you can't come up with one thing to get everything. But here's what this should be. This should be a gathering of saints who are seeking to love and obey God by the power of his Spirit, for the praise of his glory, and help others do the same. And out of love and obedience to God, to show up here with it as our intention to remember God and to celebrate redemption and to offer ourselves back to him. This is what the gathering is supposed to be. And if I can give us a little bit of an image to imagine when the church is doing it right, what is it like? Okay, when the church is doing it right, here's what it's like. It's like a wedding done right. Where when you show up to a wedding, the focus is on whom? The bride. Bride walks down, everybody's facing the bride. Bride comes here, everybody's facing the bride. In the planning of the wedding, it's bride, dear, what do you want? And everything gets structured around the bride. All the attention is on the bride. That's when church is done right, that's how it's going to be. The bride being Jesus. To the point where, like, people, I think this is true, like, especially the mother-in-law dresses in a way, like, I think you would dress, it was like, okay, I don't want to steal attention away from the bride. Is that a thing? Okay, I think that's the thing. Just everything down to the way you dress is going, I understand what this is about. It's about the bride, and anything that may detract from that, not going to do it. Don't wear white, yeah. Is beige? I don't know about beige, but don't do that. But when a wedding, here's a picture of what a wedding gone wrong would be. When those who are planning the wedding start to think, well, it's not so much about the bride, it's about the sermon. Because the sermon guy thinks it's about the sermon. And the music guy thinks, well, it's not about the bride, it's not about the sermon, it's about the music. And then the people, they're like, it's not about the bride. I don't care what the guy says. I care about the food. Like, what are we doing afterwards? And is the food going to be good? And all of a sudden, I don't think it's too hard to start making some church parallels where we would miss the mark in a gathering of God's people where it is supposed to be all attention, all affection, everything is about the bride. It's about Jesus, about what he has accomplished. It's about the holiness of God. And then for us to hijack it and go, man, I want a good message. I want the songs to be this or that. And I want there to be hot coffee. And dadgummit when it's too strong, which is not a thing. You cannot make coffee too strong. But dadgummit when this isn't right, and this isn't right, and this isn't right, and this isn't right. And I would just wonder if Jesus would come here and go, okay, for the record, I don't think in my really soul searching of what we're doing here that there's something that Jesus would start ripping out the lights. And how dare you make this? What is this irreverent water trough for a baptism? Okay, I don't think he would do that, but I do think he would come into our hearts and say, well, let me just read it. Go to verse of John 2. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name, observing his signs which he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, was not entrusting himself to them, for he knew all men, because he did not need anyone to testify concerning man, for he himself knew what was in the temple. He himself knew what? What was happening in here. And so from a leadership perspective, here's what I want you to know. I want you to know that we as elders and staff are going to be so committed to have a gathering where the bride is the focus. Where we're going to sing what's true, not what's feely. We're going to teach what's true, not what's palatable or easy to hear. We're going to exhort us to love and obey God by the power of his Spirit for the praise of his glory and actually help others do the same. We want to, as much as we can as leaders, to do those things, to create space for relationships to be formed. Okay, so coffee, great. And to have a greeting time where we're actually looking around for people we don't know so that strangers can become acquaintances, because that's a necessary step for strangers to become acquaintances who can then become friends, who can then become family. For people to be able to come in here and actually experience what God is like through his people so they can hear about it from his word, see it with their eyeballs, and say, okay, this is like a full sensory experience of what God is like in his gathering of his people. Like, I want to, I know our elders and our staff, that's the kind of gathering that we want to have, where the bride's the focus. And we're not trying to be, we're We're trying to be cool. We're trying to be popular. We're trying to love and obey God by the power of His Spirit for the praise of His glory and help others do the same. I guess what I'm trying to say is there was a perversion in the temple's purpose because there was corruption in the people's heart. That's what's happening. So here's a good question. Jesus said to them, "Stop making my Father's house a place of business." Here's a good question. If Jesus were to just pull you aside and from a place of loving anguish say, "Will, you have turned the gathering," and by gathering, I'm talking about this, what God has set apart for His worship, for people to remember Him and celebrate Him and offer themselves back to Him. You have turned the gathering into a place of what? To them, He said, business. You've turned the gathering into a place of entertainment. You just want a good show. I wonder if from a heart of loving anguish, He would say, you've turned this into a place of moral gains. You go to the gym to get your tricep gains, and you go to the church to get your moral gains so you can feel better about yourself when the truth is you are this apart from Jesus. But if you are in Christ, you are this. I wonder if He, from a heart of loving anguish, would say, you've turned the gathering into a place of empty routine. Just kind of show up, find my seat. Don't sit in my seat, please. You've turned the gathering into a place of business connections. You've turned my gathering into a place of fashion. Literally fashion. Just a place to kind of dress up nice and show off a little bit. You've turned my gathering into a place of a platform for your gifting. So you can kind of flex some of your gifting in a way that church people would go, wow, you're so good. I think the biggest one is entertainment, though, for us. And I don't know what it is for you individually, but I do want you to ask yourself, man, and I had to do this. What would Jesus say? You have turned this into It's honestly such a convicting thought. And that whole silence was me not just thinking about what to say, but if I actually wanted to say what my answer is, because it would be embarrassing. And you'd probably think less of me. Anguish in the heart of God when His people take His gathering, hijack it, and steer it towards something selfish. John wants us to see Jesus. I think he wants us to see the anguish of Jesus in this way. But in the moment, they don't see the people, they don't see anguish. They see something else. Pick up with me in verse 18. The Jews then said to him, "What sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things?" Okay, so they don't see anguish over how they've missed God's heart. They see injustice. You can't do that. What sign do you show as to your authority to be able to do this? In other words, where's your badge, Jesus? Where's your badge that says you have authority to start cracking this whip and say, get this out? Where's your badge? Because Jesus is like, you want to see my badge? Here we go. Verse 19. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They don't get it. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Tear it down, I'll raise it up. How many days? 3 days. You want a badge that is a sign that shows my authority to call out and drive out the things that anguish my heart? Here's my badge. You know what it says on it? We just read it. Resurrection. There's my badge. My badge says, beat the grave. My badge says, conquered death. This is what gives me authority to call out and drive out the things that anguish my heart. Resurrection. He has authority. And the New Testament is so clear that Christ died for all, so that those who live would no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again. That's 2 Corinthians 5. Christ died for all, so that those who live would no longer live for themselves, but for him. In other words, his resurrection is is like the primary thing that Jesus goes, I have authority. And sometimes, and so this leads me to why John, I think, puts this story right next to John 2, part 1, which is where he brings the party, brings the wine. Because John wants us to see Jesus rightly, and he wants us to see Jesus as this. He's not some Build-A-Bear Jesus where he's like, I want the Jesus that I can kind of make look like I want to look, where he brings the party, he brings the wine, he brings the joy. He's like, no. That is true. He does provide a purification that has power to remove shame and restore joy. And he has authority. He's not your genie in a bottle. He is your Lord. He is your Christ. And his badge to prove it is resurrection. And sometimes maybe Build-A-Bear isn't a great analogy, because I go to Subway more than I go to Build-A-Bear, and I get to make my own sub, and I say, I want this, 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 and this. Clint, you leave out that. Leave out that. And I think sometimes John is stripping our ability to say, Jesus, I'll take some joy, I'll take no shame, and I'll take some salvation, take some righteousness, but can you leave off the lordship? Can you leave off the authority? Prefer not to have that, thank you. It's not how it works. I was talking to a guy this morning, and I so appreciated it. I appreciate the honesty, I appreciate everything. But he goes, I don't really want to be here. And I hadn't seen him in a while. It's been 1.5 years since I had seen him. He said, I don't really want to be here. And he said, but I feel like God's telling me to. And I was so refreshed. I don't want people to not want to be here, but I do want people, I just want to be part of a group of people who goes, it doesn't really matter if I want to or not. It just matters if he wants me to or not, because he's my authority. And his resurrection says that he has authority to call out and to drive out the things that cause him anguish. He has authority. But there's one more thing I think John wants us to see about Jesus, really briefly. Not just the anguish that he has, not just the authority that he has, but in verse 21. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. See, John 2 doesn't just, it tells us about his anguish and it tells us about his authority, but it also tells us that Jesus came to be the sacrifice that was once for all, that this place of prayer and sacrifices was actually just a shadow. Okay, if you can see that. There's the shadow, and the temple was pointing to, and the temple was a shadow, and the temple is pointing to a greater substance, and that substance was Jesus. That what happened at the temple was used by God to make atonement for sin, but it was pointing to a greater substance, Jesus, who would do what no lamb could, and by the spilling of his innocent blood, that it would consume the guilt, consume the sin of the guilty. This is what John wants to help us see about Jesus. Yes, his anguish when we hijack his gatherings into something else. His authority as the beater, the conqueror of death. And his sacrifice. That he is the substance that the temple was pointing to. He wants to see Jesus so that we will believe in Jesus. I really like this. The disciples, it says they believed, right? When did they believe? What does it say? After he was raised. Well, I thought they believed in John 1. Well, they did. I thought they believed in John 2 with the wedding. Well, they did. And now, when's another time that they believed? After his resurrection. What is this helping us see about belief? Because just John wants us to help us see belief. That it's not just kind of a one-time belief, but belief, true belief in Jesus keeps going. And true belief in Jesus keeps growing. That there's a point where they're like, I believe, personal declaration of belief. And I believe again, I believe that he provides a purification. That's the power to remove shame, restore joy. I believe. And then they're like, oh man, now we see he's the substance of the sacrifice. Wow. And with his resurrection, he has authority to call out, drive out that which causes him anguish. Wow. And by his resurrection, he also has authority to consume sin, which means my heart can be at rest. Dang. I want us to see Jesus so that we will believe in Jesus, so that we'll find life in Jesus. And we, a couple weeks ago, talked about PDOBs. And I put up the email for you to be sending in some PDOBs, and you haven't gotten to hear any of them yet, but they are so good, and I appreciate you sharing so much. A PDOB is a personal declaration of belief, and this person sent one in. It's beautifully written, and it articulates so much of what can be experienced by those who really see Jesus of John 2. He brings the wine, and he cracks the whip. He removes shame. He restores joy. And I just want to read you this PDOB, what's available to those who would believe in the Jesus of John 2. This is so good. In numerous broken relationships, physical disability, and other increasing physical struggles, plaguing mental illness, and overwhelming feelings of shame, remember this. Overwhelming feelings of shame, worthlessness, rejection, confusion, weariness, incompetence, and anxiety. I have found Jesus to be a perfectly present and trustworthy shepherd, a faithful provider, John 2, protector and comforter, an ever-loving, all-wise, and sovereign Lord, and an infinitely beautiful Savior who continually invites me to come sit with him at his feasting table to find his bountiful treasures of transformational intimacy, acceptance, goodness, forgiveness, grace, mercy, tenderness, wisdom, love, joy, comfort, peace, compassion, healing, freedom, and rest. Man, for those who can see the Jesus of John 2, the one who provided a purification that the system could only symbolize, the one who anguishes when we hijack his gatherings to make it about us, the one who has authority to call it out and drive it out, and the one who was the perfect sacrifice that even though we are this and deserve God's wrath, he came to be this. And there is so much joy in that. So I want to give us a second to confess to the Lord, to let him call out specifically what happens in here when you show up. In what way have you hijacked what happens in here to make it about yourself? And then we're going to have a time where we sing like always. And it's not just reflection, it's actually practice. It's practice to say, I want to end the service with my eyes in the right spot. Not here. The bride. So we're going to practice that together. And whatever fight needs to happen inside you to get your mind off of the other things and go, that anguishes God's heart. When I'm looking at my watch, Lord, change me, send me, help me. I want to worship you. Let's do that together.